This video is going to be on graphing sine and cosine. That just means we're going to put a picture up on a graph of what it looks like as you start going through the values. When you plug in a number, an angle in, what do you get out? It's important to know these because these are one of the more applicable pieces of um, in the math world is sine and cosine. They're very, very applicable. One of the things that makes them applicable is the fact that they're repeating. They're called periodic, which just means in one period it makes uh, this chunk of the graph that just continually repeats, and repeats forever and ever. So this is the sine graph right here. This is the portion that we focus on, because if you can look at this left side, it's the exact same picture. It's just over here on the left. And if you were to continue looking at the graph, it would make that exact same shape again and again and again and again. So for a sine, that's the portion that we're going to focus on right there. That's called one period. As far as cosine goes, this is the place that we're going to focus on. And again, it goes on forever to the right, it goes on forever to the left, and just keeps repeating it again and again and again. Okay, next is called the midline. That's halfway in between the maximum and the minimum. For example, this is the highest spot, this is the maximum. This right here is the lowest spot, so that's the minimum. And halfway between is the midline, this guy right here. Is the midline, middle of the graph. Okay, amplitude. Now this is a different word. This is talking about kind of the height of your graph. How far is it from that midline up to that maximum, or from that midline down to that minimum? Well, in this case, we started at 0, right here, 0. And we went up over here, so our maximum is at 1. And it's got pi halves down here, comma, 1. That would be our amplitude. The fact that it's from here to here, our amplitude is 1. It's the same distance if you go downwards. If you start at the x-axis and you go down, we go down one whole piece. We were at 0. Now we're at -1. Amplitude is the absolute value. You can calculate it by looking at the graph. The maximum y was 1. Oh, maximum y is 1. Minimum y is -1. Sorry, I was trying to label this point. So to find that amplitude, we're going to take the maximum the maximum y, which was 1, minus the minimum y, which is -1, over 2. So on top, that's actually 1 plus 1. The bottom is 2 over 2, or 1. So our amplitude is 1. Now, if you look at the cosine graph, the same thing applies from the midline, right? Midline, because here's the max, here's the min. Distance from that midline, which starts at 0 up to that maximum, is 1. From the midline down to the minimum is 1. And we're talking distance, we're not talking value, we're talking the distance from there to there. Distance is always positive. So we'd end up having the exact same amplitude. I mean, you can tell amplitude from the graph pretty easy if you identify that midline and then just count up to that maximum or down to that minimum. They'll be the same if you're at the midline, and then that would be your amplitude. If you're not okay with that, then here's a nice little formula for you to use. Okay, this is what your basic graphs are going to look like. They're going to be y equals some number a times the sine of, and then inside parentheses, a number b times x. Or it could be the cosine over here. Those letters are specific for certain things. If you look out in front of a trig function, that number out in front, the a, That's your amplitude. So all you have to do is look at a graph, identify that number out in front, and that's your amplitude. Notice the absolute value bars is because it's always positive. Okay, and then the other thing we talk about is period. Now remember when I talked about the graph, we were discussing just one portion of the graph, this blue part right here, because that is one period. That is the part of the graph that keeps repeating. That's one section of it. But if you're just given the equation and you want to calculate the period, this is the formula for it. So period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b, and b is literally just that number that's inside in front of the x. So you just divide them out. You take 2 pi, divide it by whatever that number is, simplify it, and that's how long your period is. How long from start to finish does it take to get to the end of that graph? Let's try some. Let's go with amplitude first. Amplitude is the number out front here. Uh-oh, there is no number. Yes, there is. Superman. Sorry, Super One. Da, da, da. Here I am. I'll save the day. I'm always here. That's the amplitude. And then period, a little bit of math. This is going to be 2 pi divided by, now we need this number, b, right here. So we're going to divide by 2. All right, 2 pi divided by 2, those 2's will cancel, and all we're left with is pi. So amplitude of 1, period is pi. All right, how about this one below? Here's the amplitude. So our amplitude is going to equal 1/3. And then the period, again, we have to do a little bit of calculation. This is our b right here. Is 1/2. It's okay to have fractions. We'll just do it the long way. If you have a fraction for your b, we're going 2 pi divided by b. That's 2 pi divided by 1/2. And then to divide by a fraction, you have to keep the first thing. You change it to multiplication, and you do the reciprocal. So straight across, 2 pi times 2, that's 4 pi. So our period is 4 pi. Now it feels weird to say period is 4 pi and stuff, but on a graph, when we label it in terms of pi, in radian mode. There's some that are done in degrees as well, but we're going to stick with radians. All right, let's try some of these. Identify the amplitude and period. So I'm looking here. There's a 1 out in front, superhero, so that's my amplitude. Period, though, we've got to take 2 pi and divide it by b. That's this guy. B is 4. Okay, got to reduce down that fraction. 2 goes into 2 one time and into 4 two times. So our period is going to be 1 pi over 2. Okay, this one. We've got an A out in front. That's A right there. So our amplitude, really easy, is just 2. This fraction here is our B, but that's okay. Period's going to equal 2 pi. Now because it's a fraction, I'm writing it out with the long division symbol, because to multiply, or sorry, to divide by fraction, I know that you have to take the first one and keep it, then multiply by the reciprocal. All right, that becomes 3 times 2 is 6 pi over 1 times 2 is 2, but those reduce a little bit. 2 goes into 6 3 times. There's a 1 there, so your final period is 3 pi. So this part right here, this finding the period, that takes a little bit of calculation, and you do have to deal with fractions. But if you enter it correctly in the calculator and leave the pi out, you could have right here just gone in your calculator 2 divided by parentheses 2 divided by 3. And then, of course, math enter, enter, just in case it's another fraction. But if you plug that into the calculator, it would spit out 3, and then you throw the pi back on there. So you can do it with the calculator. Just don't do pi, no pi. Don't plug in pi. No pi, just put it in your answer. Okay, amplitude and period, those are the two main things that you have to be able to identify to graph sine and cosine function. So this time now we're looking at a graph again. It says, what are the amplitude and period for each of the following? All right, amplitude, if you remember, is how high it goes, how low it goes, and they'll be the same amount. Looks like we went from 0 here up to 5, down to -5. That means your amplitude is 5. Now the cool thing about graphs, after they're graphed, this last point right here, that's your period. Wherever that one cycle ends, and remember, it's only one cycle. If you keep going more than one cycle, you're not doing a period, you're doing more than the period. So amplitude is 5, period is 2 pi. Here's a good example of what I was just talking about. We look at one cycle, starting at 0, 0, we go up, down, and back to the intercept. That is one cycle, which means our period is 2 pi. And then if you look at the highest spot right up here at 3, started at 0, we went up 3 or down 3, so our amplitude is 3. All right, see here. Again, we're doing sine, starts here at 0, one cycle, bam, up, down, back to the x-axis, and it looks like the line kind of goes through it, but that right there is actually 2 pi over 3. If you look at your notes quick, if you look really closely at your notes, you'll see that it said 2 pi over 3. Okay, amplitude. Amplitude's easy. Here's the midline. Goes up to 3, down to -3. So that means our amplitude must be 3. Okay, this one now is a cosine. So cosine looks like this. That right there is one cycle. Looks like the cycle ends at pi. So guess what? There's our period. 0 is right here, and it starts up here at 2. The lowest it goes is -2, which means our amplitude is going to be 2.